unlike you, I watched the whole thing live.
Okay.
With
Yeah, I don't watch live anything.
no, you shouldn't anymore because it's not valuable. Because you just wasted your time if you have something better to do. There's no point in sitting down and like, oh, the TV doesn't tell us anymore. You need to sit down here and watch me.
Right.
Like, it just doesn't do that anymore.
Yeah.
So I watched it live, and the whole thing happened. I could tell that they tried to fix the edit. They tried to cut it. In the live stream, they were doing their best to cover up anything that happened and make it seem like they could make up the story later for anybody who wasn't there, like you would do if you were running that event. And so I knew that was real as soon as it happened. But you get a chance to watch it after having heard about it from everybody else. So what did you think?
I mean, I thought a couple of things. One is, as somebody that writes comedy, I thought this is just more cancel culture, but it's in-person cancel culture. The comedians are getting the comedians that are actually funny are the ones telling the truth. And we're increasingly living in a truth-free zone where the truth is dangerous to the powers that be, because the powers that be don't want freedom for the world, and truth sets us free. And so comedians are dangerous. And so my first thought was, this has been going on for a while, and this is the first time we're seeing it up in person. Now it's actually less dangerous one-on-one than most of the comedian slapping that's been going on, where they cancel Twitter, lose your job, get kicked out of society, basically. This is less dangerous but more poignant, right? In terms of a moment, right? You've seen a lot of comedians get canceled or get rolled back on something, or they're afraid their old jokes are going to come out again, or a guy like well, there's so many comedians that used to have a section in their stand-up about homosexuals. Or, it was just a standard. Yeah. Like, you had to have one of those. Yeah.
Because ultimately, what makes something funny is reality.
Right. Is that, and it's pointing to the bits of reality that it's not. So there's a couple of ways that you can be funny with truth, but one of the most effective ones is pointing to those bits of reality that people have experienced, but they know they're not supposed to talk about. And that feeling of discomfort and the feeling of humor are so close to one another that they bleed into one another. And so those truths that we're uncomfortable with make us laugh. But they have a really positive effect, right? If you're a bunch of people laughing together, quit being rivals, right? It has a knitting effect communally. Laughter does. And so there's something important that an important role that comedians play in society, and it can go wrong, right? There's laws in Leviticus about how you're not allowed to trip blind people, right? And you think, well, that's weird, except for when you've been around to non-Christian areas, right? That's a standard joke, that where the blind person becomes, everybody laughs at the blind person.
The wrong person, right?
Yeah,
you're getting punked.
Yeah, you
punked the
blind person, and everybody laughs at it.
Dude, that's a good point.
Yeah, but that's bad for society, right? God literally puts it in the law. You're not allowed to trip a blind person.
This is my theonomy. My theonomy just went overflow. Like, oh wow, I didn't even apply that one yet.
So it's a societal protection that we need, because it's so easy, it's so funny.
Because we won't have. It's the same thing that I think with eye for eye and tooth for tooth is what it's doing.
Yeah,
it's saying like you can't mete out this type of joke, or these people are outside of that category. There's always a protected class.
There's always right, and in the protected class, it's not the king, right? It's not it's not the high priest, right? It's the blind person.
Right.
so the protected class, scripturally speaking, from humor,
Yeah.
is the handicapped, right?
So then, would you say that then Chris Rock's joke went too far because she has
So
alopecia?
so if he knew, and that's the thing is
He did know.
He did know.
He didn't know. That's so far.
Yeah,
it's
so
like,
far
no,
that's
he had
so
known.
so that's where, like, did he know? I don't know. I haven't really even read up on it much.
Because there are like biblically, if you know something and you do it, there's a different
Right. It's a
punishment
different
versus somebody
exactly.
who doesn't know.
Right.
And, then
And it's like the difference between bringing a full goat for atonement and having to bring an offering.
Right. That's exactly
smaller. That's
Leviticus matters.
Yeah, right. Oh yeah. I love the book of Leviticus.
That's funny. Anyway, yeah.
So you have this situation where he poked a bear that I think he didn't realize he was poking, right? His response, because his response was, I just got the hell, Will Smith just smacked the hell out of me on live TV, right? I think he responded really well in the midst of it. And maybe he was thinking like, I'm not sure what I just did, but I did something, I stepped over something, right?
Yeah.
And there's an aspect in which, like, growing up, that's kind of how you learned where the lines were in junior high. You make jokes and stuff, and then your friend turns around and punches you, and you're like, oh, I learned.
Dude, it was
there's
a joke.
line.
My mama is off limits for you, okay? Just so you know, mama jokes.
It's like there's and you learn that in a community of friends. That's how you learn stuff, right? On live TV.
I think he was fine with taking the smack too. I think Chris Rock was fine with taking the smack, but because he's like, okay, well, he just smacked me on TV. This is great. All right, my bad, dude. Like, and then he probably had a couple more jokes. He's like, but I want to say them because I don't want to. My other side of my face, I don't want to feel as numb as my right side.
You can see him doing the social calculations.
Running the math. Yeah, he was running the math. But then I think when Will started yelling at him from his seat, he realized, oh, this is more serious than I thought it was.
Right.
And that's when he kind of backed up and said, let me...
He backed way up.
Yeah.
He backed way up. He started over and said, okay, we're going a different direction, right? Which I think was the right thing to do. His joke was over the line, wrong. And so you had this weird situation where Will Smith is in a society where that's what you do when the jester goes over the line, whatever the line currently is, right, is coercive violence. Now, if you can't get to them, you use Twitter, whatever.
This is what we saw in the whole riots after George Floyd,
right? Yeah.
So
that the acceptable response is coercive violence, and scripturally speaking, that's not the case. But it was. I thought my first thought was par for the course, right? That's the kind of society we live in now. The term "don't shoot the messenger" comes from Tudor. The Tudor era kings used to send their jester as messengers, and if they had a message they didn't like, they would chop the head off the jester and shoot it over the wall, back at you, right? They would stick it in the catapult. And so, don't shoot the messenger. But because there's no room for jokes, right? There's no room for a jester in wartime. If you've got an absolute rivalry, an absolute war, if you've got in a total war situation, there's no room for jesters, and that's how you test what kind of relationship do we have. I'll send the jester over. Let's see, and if the jester comes back, you realize, okay, we're not at total war yet. But if you send a jester in with your message, and they say, nope, not having that, and they kill the jester and shoot him back at you with a catapult, then okay, we're in a total warfare situation. There's no room for jokes anymore, and no room for peace.
When a society loses its humor, loses its comedy.
Yeah, you're in some sort of totalizing totalitarian situation, right?
That's an interesting way to look at it. So when comedy is gone, when humor is gone, that is pointing to something in reality, to say some part of reality is flipped upside down.
Right, right.
So that nothing is funny anymore, or you can't have
humor anymore, right? So because we're beyond it, right? We're beyond that situation. Now, in a Christian worldview, you're never beyond humor because the entirety of world history is a comedy, right? God, he has a straight man named Satan that keeps trying to set things up, and then he keeps pulling gags on Satan over and over.
He's Wile E. Coyote.
Right, exactly. And the resurrection is the biggest punchline of them all, right? Where you see Satan thinks, I've finally got him. Right?
I killed him.
Yeah, I killed him, right?
Come back from death.
And then he looks down and he realizes he's out off over the cliff. You know,
that's interesting.
So there's this deep, fundamental comedic nature to the way God interacts with the world and with evil and with history. And he even, the greatest callback of all time in terms of punchline callback is going to be the resurrection at the end of time. Jesus is the first fruits, the beginning of the resurrection, but it's all just the first hint at the punchline. And there's a full-on callback coming at the end when everything is raised, right?
So then with the world like it is, because every comedian saw that when Kathy Griffin gets up there and says, that's too far.
Right.
Like Kathy Griffin.
Kathy Griffin holding the Trump's head up and says, that's too far,
too
right?
Far. Yeah. Because a comedian getting smacked, and I said this on Whitlock, if he deserves to get smacked, then what do I deserve?
What do I deserve?
Right?
Yeah.
And so the comedians are saying this is going too far. And so now every comedian has been scared to tell the jokes that they know they really want to tell, except Dave Chappelle.
Right.
Every comedian except Dave Chappelle. And everybody saw Dave Chappelle and was like, oh, okay, so that trajectory is now open. But
I don't know if it is, because even Chappelle...
No, you're right. It's not, but there's a few.
There's a few that were like, okay, good.
Kevin Hart didn't stand up and say, I'm going that direction. Right. He didn't do that.
So Chappelle stood up and he said, I'm going this way, closed the door behind him and said, anybody coming? And I don't know if anybody's coming or not.
There's a few. There's only like 3 or 4 comedians that I know that are saying, I'm going to say what I want to say.
Right.
But how do Christians then so there was a time where in the black community, ministers were respected.
Right.
Not just pastors, ministers of the gospel were respected.
Yep.
And pastors were highly respected. If you go back and trace the black community, they were the ones driving and leading the black community. They were the ones who could read. They were the ones who were educated. They were the ones who made political decisions for us. Here's how we're going to move. They were the direction in which the black community had success, right?
Yeah.
It came through the pastor. And now the pastors in our communities are nothing more than a dead carcass.
Right.
That said, I guess that thing used to be pretty huge. It's a huge dead carcass, right?
And there was a significant sellout moment.
Yes, there's when I want to mark that at the pro-life moment. At the pro-life moment where, because Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson were huge pro-life folks before he started to run for president, before Jesse Jackson, in the late 80s, mid 80s or something like that. And that was the moment that I marked this. Well, actually, let's just be honest. The guys at Uncle Tom are working on their new film, Uncle Tom 2, and I think they're doing something spectacular with what they're doing with their film. They're bringing out the fact that they probably would not say it like this at all, so I want to preface it properly. This is how I see what they're doing.
Yeah.
I think they're bringing out the fact that the civil rights movement was compromised from the beginning.
Right.
It wasn't as sanctimonious as some people like to make it. It was compromised from jump, right? So I'm really excited about this because I think they're absolutely right. I don't think they're wrong about that at all. It was compromised from jump. And so there's a lot of things going on there that have led to a particular type of trajectory. The strength of the black community came from its pastors and its families.
Yeah.
Those two things. That community in and of itself is what it was, and then that got hijacked by the feminist, social justice, Marxist form of government. If you go back and you listen to almost everything that Martin Luther King talked about, he was pushing the idea of we're going to make the government do stuff for us.
Right.
Right? Well, the tradition from black culture from before was we'll do stuff for ourselves because they ain't never going to do nothing for us that don't hurt us at the end of the day.
Right.
Which was true.
Right.
And so that turn in the civil rights movement was really a turn for the move of the government to allow black people in so that it can Trojan horse everything else inside of it. Homosexuality, sexual morality.
Do you think that maybe folks at the top, but most folks didn't realize what the Trojan horse had inside of it?
I don't think so. When you have people who are hurting, they just want help.
Yeah,
they just want out. And so what they get used and manipulated. This is like don't trip a blind man.
Right.
This goes in the same thing. You have people who are in need and who need help, and you saw that opportunity. And what you're going to do is you took advantage of those people.
You see that with Al Sharpton to this day.
Exactly.
You're like, what is wrong? What are you thinking?
Exactly. But I was bringing all that up to say, like, do you think that when you have that kind of move and you have that type of drift, and you see the culture completely changing from the foundations that it came from, how do you still, as a Christian, believe in the world that exists in the sense like, I know God is making a joke.
Right.
I know that this is comedic.
Yeah.
And though they won't let me speak in it that way, how do you then... Because I think there's some people who want to take and say, well, I'm going to do it in such a way that it doesn't have effect to the rhetoric anymore. It's just a smear in your face. Right? Instead of saying, I'm actually going to use the rhetoric to be the thing that moves the Overton window and you and the people at the same time. Because I don't think you have to have one or the other.
Right.
But I could be wrong about that. I think you can absolutely have... I think that the rhetoric is so good. Shakespeare was so good at his craft that he was able to move the American mind for years. Right. Years. To the point that people are still doing it. Denzel, right?
Yeah.
And Macbeth, and everybody's getting it.
Right, yeah. Denzel kills it in the new Macbeth.
Don't spoil it. It's not like I don't know what...
But the new Weezer album that came out last week, the first two songs are about Shakespeare, right? You've got so Shakespeare.
He won.
Right, he won by being better at it than everyone else, right? He won by being better at the craft, and he actually brings a full-orbed Christian worldview with him everywhere he goes. The metaphysics, the cosmology, everything.
Yeah.
And he doesn't argue for it. He just shows you how beautiful it is. And so what you have is all these people people read Shakespeare. Jane Austen is very similar. They read Jane Austen and they say, "Oh man, I wish it could be like that again." Right? I wish we could get back to that it was so beautiful, right? So there's a training of the emotions, a training of the affections of what you love and what you think is beautiful that happens through well-told stories, great poetry, great drama, that you can't just get in a straightforward way. So I just come in and say, you know what you ought to think is beautiful. That doesn't work.
That's what we're doing right now.
That's what we're doing right now. So facts don't care about your feelings.
My feelings don't care about your facts.
And so you end up with this separation of facts and feelings because you don't actually have an understanding of how the world integrates. But because it integrates, it integrates. It's not a series of cold hard facts combined with or over against emotional states. The way we tend to say, well, which one are we going to be? Are we going to be realists or are we going to be romantics? Right? Because that's what you ended up with was this separation into realists, scientific realism, and romantics right at the same time. because they didn't think that the world could hold together. Whereas but it's because it holds together.
Between the two of those, it's either the world's made either this way or that way. The world can't be made where these two come together.
They can't come together, but it's because we don't see that the world actually, the way that it holds together is as a story, right? So when you confront something like the people that are, like these people are tearing down the church, they're going after the church or something, and like you see down in you saw with John MacArthur's standoff, right, where he comes out and speaks to the politicians or the sheriff or whatever, and he says, well, look, these people are all, I can leave them out front. They're coming one way or the other. I can lock them out, and we can meet out here and spill over into the streets, or I can open the doors and welcome them in. And I think that's what Jesus wants me to do. I'm going to open the doors. I'm going to welcome them in. They want to be here in the midst of God's people. They're adults. Let them they're taking a risk that they think is worth the risk, right? And when you see the attack that starts to happen, there's different ways that you can look at it, right? You can look at it and say, pause, right? Here in this moment, here is the attack. There's no way you're going to overcome this. They have all of the coercive power. They have all of the things, right? We don't have the guns. We don't have the police stations, the jails, right? They have all of those. There's no way we're going to win this when you pause it in the moment. Psalm 3 tells us, though, that when the enemy digs a pit to trap you, he will fall in it himself, right? Which is funny, right? It's a joke. God's like, here's the punchline. I'm going to tell you the punchline in advance, right? They're going to fall in the trap themselves. And so then you can sit and watch them build the trap thinking, oh man,
they don't have any idea.
You think they're going in head first and knees first, or like, how's that going to work?
You get to laugh at the joke from beginning to end.
From beginning to end.
Yeah.
But it's knowing that the way that it holds together, the way that God integrates it is as a story. So it's not integrated as moments of hard fact or with moments of emotional response. It's integrated in a plot. It's integrated in a narrative and in an arc.
This is why a lot of I keep coming back to this, a lot of our exegesis really does suck. Mm-hmm. Because we have no place for that story in how we exegete scripture.
Right. So we're always looking for the facts that we can pull out, pinned to the board like dead butterflies. So here are all the facts. Aren't they beautiful? Like, yeah, those are pretty facts.
Those are pretty facts.
Yeah,
and they're
dead. Right? Yeah,
which is why people get discouraged, because they don't get a chance to see the living beauty of the facts in reality. So then, when what it does is create a suspicious faith.
Right. It does.
It creates a suspicious faith because you're like, those are supposed to fly, and you want me to believe that, and that's what the facts are?
Right. Those are the facts.
I don't see that.
And but here's the thing, though. God sometimes comes along and he breathes onto all of our dead butterfly facts, and they start to fly, right?
And we keep trying to pin him down. He's like, no.
That's one of the problems of a new convert, right? Or a new Calvinist too, is to come along and like, this stuff's amazing, and you're like, settle down, leave them pinned to the board where they're safe and they don't do any harm.
But it's
right?
got wings.
Yeah, it's got wings. It can fly. And pretty soon, you get a bunch of old men complaining about the new Calvinists, and you're like, why are you complaining about it?
Disciple these brothers.
Disciple these kids that are so excited. It's like, just because God breathed on their butterflies and made them fly around and they're enjoying it. It's like, it's messy and they've got tattoos and all that, but just disciple them, like bring them all in. And
see, I've always
learn from them, because they're excited about it.
So I've always thought, when I saw the young, restless, and reformed groups coming, I have a different perspective on than everybody says. Oh, see, I told you this was going to happen.
Yeah, it went wrong.
Yeah, it went wrong because I've made the argument that the responsibility for the maturity of this group was the mature ones.
Right.
Right? So when we went wrong...
Good thing we didn't let any of them in to be disciples.
Because we could have totally messed up everything. This cathedral wasn't built off of recklessness, people.
Right.
Right? You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
But here's the thing, like, you hear about the stories of Luther meeting with Zwingli and pounding his shoe on the table and refusing to come back to the table. And look, the first Reformation was a disaster. Right? Mm-hmm. And God still overturned the world and brought freedom to the nations and all over.
And we always brag about it. Matter of fact, we're reformers. We're sinful reformata, baby.
Right. And then we're like, oh, and a bunch of new Calvinists, and we say, can't trust them. They're not decent and in order. You're like, yeah, like the first time. You remember that? You remember John Owen fleeing across the country, barely staying alive because of how dangerous and messy and everything. I mean, we want cold hard facts because we are children of the Enlightenment. God gives stories because He is bringing us to reality.
So can I, from what I've been learning from our conversations, the reason that stories are important, the reason that poetry is important, because ultimately, apart from story and poetry, we can't hold things together like we should with the Trinity.
Right. Yeah, we can't hold facts together that we look at and we say, God says both those are true. How do I
hold these two
paradoxes?
paradoxes?
How do I hold these? Yeah.
And so we don't have an armature, right? You know, there's I can't remember, what's his name?
Brian McDonald.
Brian McDonald, storyteller, brilliant guy. Yeah. He gets how to tell stories.
He's the one that trained all the Pixar storytellers.
Exactly.
Yeah, the early ones.
Yeah, the good ones.
Yeah.
And he has this framing, he talks about an armature, and what it basically is how the old puppets used to be made. They had to have a frame that they built out in order for everything to hold onto that frame and to be able to work. And so he's like, you build the armature and then you put the meat and the bones on it, and that's the foundation of everything that you have. I don't think that, since we've been talking, I think what I've been noticing, even just with myself, is that my armature is not set up to handle the world the way it actually is.
Right.
And so I don't know, I've been learning now over the last few years, and particularly in us just talking, man, it's been a blessing, how to have the type of foundation armature that allows the world, like you said, hold together, where it's not just facts and it's not just feelings, but these two things marry together in such a way that it becomes beautiful, right? Because one without the other, you don't get beauty at the end of the day. But I think our last conversation on identity has, really been driving the narrative. Well, we've been talking about this even before that. I wish we had some more of our telephone conversations recorded because that's where it really comes out, where it's like, oh, this is a Trinitarian problem, and I think two things: Trinitarian problem, symbolic problem, and not understanding the purpose of the Lord's table and baptism. So last week, you really were making the case about like, this is, we were arguing back and forth about what about people who have different positions? How do we get in fellowship, especially if it's like, and you're like, that's not justification. Like the thing that binds you together with the other bricks in the wall is justification. You are all justified. That is, and so inside of that, you might be a brick at the bottom or a brick at the top, or but justification is the thing that holds it all together. And the thing that I think the Trinity shows us how it all works, and from creation on, right?
Right.
And so I'm trying to figure out how to put this. So you got the Trinity that shows us like the ontological realities versus the economic realities, which is what you were just talking about. And then you have experiencing God through symbols. Right.
That you can.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Without sounding like a heretic?
No.
Because
or through that images can truly communicate. So and it's something that I hear Christians deny all the time. right? And it drives me nuts because fundamental reality is that way,
Heavens
right?
declare the glory of God.
What even more fundamental than that, right? Jesus says, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." Jesus is a symbol. He's an image of the Father, and by seeing the image of the Father in Jesus, you truly have seen the Father. The poetic nature of knowledge goes all the way down to knowing God. Right. So have I ever met with the Father? Well, no, I've only met with Jesus. But therefore I have met with the Father. Right? So if you want to know what the Father is like, you look at Jesus. He is the perfect representation of the Father. He is the Word and he is the image, right? He's called both. And he is that makes him the perfect representation of the Father. So if you've seen Jesus, you've seen the Father. That's a fundamental poetic knowledge that goes all the way down to the basis of reality, right?
And a paradox in one way we should be fine with.
Right, that we should, and we are fine with it as when we're talking Trinity, right? Except for, this is what surprises me, is when you say to people, well, how does God interact with our sin, right? And then next you say, well, how does Jesus interact with our sin? And you get different answers from people, right? How does God interact with our sin? Well, he's angry. He's frustrated with us. He's embarrassed of us, right? Well, how does Jesus interact with your sin? It was like, well, no, Jesus is loving. He forgives. And how can those two answers be different? They can't be. That is, if you want to know how God interacts with anything, you look at Jesus. Jesus is the full representation, the perfect vision of God, right? Jesus is how we know the Father. Jesus is how we know God, right? He is and Christians will separate God into here's how he is, and then Jesus here's how he is, and they're getting that from the pulpit, right? And it's because
Go ahead.
they don't understand how God communicates himself to us.
Are they trying to hold the Trinity together by economic realities and then splitting ontologically? Is that what they're doing?
I think they have lost any sense of what it would be to have an integrated world, because the disintegrated understanding goes all the way down to the Trinity.
Or how we understand the Trinity, everything disintegrated world comes all the way from that. Yeah.
So as if the Father and the Son are opposed to one another, and the Father wanted to destroy us, but the Son came in and rescued us. Right?
They put those two
things. And you hear that.
Interesting.
You hear that in bits and pieces, because I know you don't find pastors that teach that on purpose, right? It's an accidental. It's because there's something more fundamental underneath in their understanding of knowledge, I think, that actually gets in the way of being able to know that God is revealed himself perfectly in Jesus. And if you want to know what the God is like, you look at Jesus.
So our social justice, critical race theory, intersectionality, racism, all of our problems that I'm seeing right now in our culture are traced to me back right directly to Christianity, to the church, right? Like that's clearly, we talked about this last week. If we can't figure out how to fellowship around the Lord's table in church membership, we're not figuring out critical race theory.
Right.
We're not figuring out the social justice. We're not figuring out how to fellowship with Christians who have different perspectives on Scripture than we do, right? We can't figure that out. We can't figure that out in the world. We can't figure out politics of how these things can be together and yet separate, and how to take care of the poor. We can't figure any of this stuff out because we can't figure out just how to fellowship with each other.
Right.
And so we've had to drill all the way back down to the Trinity. And so here there's a couple. So you told me to read this. Now this is a shame. Calvin's Doctrine of the Word and Sacrament by Ronald Wallace. Now you told me to read this book, but this is the ugliest cover of a book.
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
that I've seen. Does yours look like this too?
No, mine is just a hardback. But I just got it. So I got that book. I photocopied that book about 20 years ago.
It's not that old.
Is it not that old?
No, I'm trying to figure out. Like,
yeah. Well, hey, so I heard about it when it was first coming out, and I went up to the...
What's the copyright on it?
1997, yeah. So
that's 20 years ago.
So somewhere around 2002, 2003, I went down to the Gonzaga Library and got a copy of it, and I photocopied it at the Gonzaga Library because I couldn't afford it.
You photocopied the whole thing?
Photocopied the entire book.
Well, that's some commitment. That's a massive commitment.
So you can have, you can legally have one photocopy of every book if you at the library for personal purposes, so long as you don't make money off it. It's for research or whatever. So I went down and I photocopied a handful of books, and so I had just a photocopied version for years, and then at the Fight Laugh Feast.
Oh, Uncle Gary has some.
Yeah, and I was like, oh my gosh, I've never owned this book. I've only had a photocopy of it.
I saw this book there. It's an older, like more original one too. It's like a classic, and I was like, I don't need that. I mean, I know Calvin, I know Sacrament. I'm good, right?
So I snagged it, and I was really excited. But this book was major for me in turning my understanding.
But the cover's so ugly.
Yeah, that's terrible. That's a really bad
I didn't even, when you told me to get this, I was like, why would I get this book and read it? I got it because you told me to read it, so I'm like, okay, I'll go get it. But the cover is so ugly, I never wanted to pick it up and read it.
Yeah, the cover doesn't believe what's in the book. That's the problem.
Facts. Facts. So I got the book. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. What were you saying?
Well, just the fundamental understanding of the kind of world we live in. That was the book that opened it up for the first time to me.
There's so many places I want to read. So I got a couple places highlighted that I thought I had to put the book down at points because I got to past the first chapter and I was like, I need to go back and read that again. And he's not doing any super profound stuff. He's just making the stuff that I know come to life.
Right.
And then I realized how
he's taking a butterfly that's pinned and he's blowing and it's coming to life and you're like, oh, that's what that butterfly is for.
That's how it moves.
Yeah.
I always wondered how. And so it made me think, you go to seminary, you learn about the sacraments. It's so wooden.
Yeah. Because you learn you spend your time learning what the sacraments aren't. Right? Because we learn it through the controversies surrounding the sacraments.
Right.
Right. Rather than learning it through what power did the sacraments bring into the world that transformed the world. Right. We don't learn that. We learn not to be a Roman Catholic.
You don't learn the metaphysics of the sacrament, right?
Yeah. You learn the errors.
And don't step in the errors.
Yeah, you walk away saying, okay, well, I should not be an Aristotelian in my sacramental theology, right? That's what we tend to walk away from.
Let me just read. So I'm going to just read some stuff. So this is page 5. It says, the sign or symbol of God's presence holds the attention of the worshiper and obscures the glory of the one who is seeking to reveal himself by means of it. Calvin calls the ark and the burning bush symbols of the presence of God. But this term can also be applied to the cloud and smoke and the flame and other accompanying phenomena of the Old Testament revelation. And so I was thinking, he continues to go, but I started thinking like, okay, we have symbols in the scripture, and we look at those and we're like, God was with his people. God was literally with his people.
Yeah.
And that's God. So we see it in the cloud. We see it. So we're like, that's God.
Right.
with his people, real relationship. And then we get into the New Testament, and we get into the New Testament church, and we come to our modern time, and then we don't use symbols anymore in that way where that's God with his people.
Right.
Right? And so, where is it? I'm trying to find it here. So, hence we learn that profitable doctrine that whenever God grants the token of his presence, he's undoubtedly present with us. He does not amuse us by unmeaning shapes, since therefore the exhibition was to deceitfully representation of the presence of God. Isaiah justly declares that he saw God in the representation there, and there is no deception.
Right. And this is that Trinitarian understanding that an image can truly communicate.
Right. So I'm just highlighting stuff. So he said the whole story of the Old Testament is thus the story of how Christ, the Word of God, breaks in upon the life of those whom he has chosen to make his people and confronts them in these veiled forms through which they can come to know him, his nature, and have communion with him.
Right.
There's a lot that hasn't gone away, though.
Mm-mm. No, it's actually gotten more so that way, right? John 6, Jesus says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, Moses gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he which comes down from heaven and gives life into the world," right? He's like, so you got the presence of God in the manna. Remember that? Now what which God was truly communicating himself to them. I'm with you. I'm taking care of you. I'm feeding you.
We are communing.
In Deuteronomy 6-8, Moses says, what you should have taken away from the manna and from your hunger when you're in the wilderness, right? You got hungry and God hadn't given you manna yet, and you cried out. What you should have said is, man does not live by bread alone, right? And then when he provides the manna, then you realize that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, right? So that manna is, the hunger is a sign from God that you need more than bread, right? Which goes all the way back to the garden. Wakes Adam up. Hey, that hunger pang, it's for me, right? Ultimately, you're hungry because you're made for fellowship with me, ultimately. And then in the wilderness, Moses says, remember when we were wandering around and you complained that you were hungry? God's trying to kill us out here. That should have actually communicated to you, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And then when he provides the bread of manna, he's providing communion with himself, right? He's providing a promise that he will always take care of you, not just in the wilderness, but when you're in the land too, right? So all of this is communicating. And then Jesus says, remember that man in the wilderness? That was pointing to me. The ultimate fulfillment, I am the ultimate bread of life, right? So there's layers and layers of metaphor, layers of poetry, layers of communication that God snowballs into communion. Right? He snowballs because when Jesus goes out into the wilderness is tempted by the devil, that's what he quotes. He quotes, man shall not live by bread alone, but he quotes what they should have said in the temptation when they were in the wilderness, hungry and tempted about food. Jesus quotes what they should have said, and then he goes out and he talks to the Pharisees, and he says, you know what you really need to do is come over and eat the living bread, which is my flesh. And they say, this is John 6:52. The Jews therefore strove among themselves, how can this man give us his flesh to eat, right? They're poetically dull, right? They're
poetically dull.
Yeah, and it's a spiritual problem, right? Their poetic dullness is a spiritual problem at root, where they have...
It's a broken metaphysics of how the world is made and who God is.
And who God is, right?
Right. He's a father that feeds his children.
He's a father that feeds his children. But the food, is a feeding of them on himself, right?
So this is I think this is so I can't, this is page 3 of this book.
Yeah.
Now, because this book cover is so ugly, I got to say this: ignore the cover.
Right, I know, isn't that
Get
the worst?
book, paint the cover whatever you want to that makes you open this book up, because you has to. So Wallace is it Wallace?
Yeah.
Is talking as a Calvin. He says, as we cannot attain to that infinite height to which he is exalted, in descending among us by the exercise of his power and grace, he appears as near as is needful and as limited capacity will bear. He, as it were, veils himself in earthly symbols and placing before the vision of men certain signs which can indicate the humble and believing mind, indicate that the humble and believing mind that he is present. Such symbols and signs at the same time indirectly represent his hidden being and convey what he has to say to man at the moment of revelation.
What this revealed to me when I first read it was that I really thought I don't want anything between me and God. I want just him directly with no
chasing.
No chasing. right. Yeah. And you read this and you think, oh, I'm arrogant. Who do I think I am that I could possibly stand face to face with God and just like I don't need God to condescend to me. I will go ahead and I'll go up there.
I just want the purest
form.
Right.
And you realize it's not, you don't get the purest form. You get nothing that way, right? There's nothing in our life that we take in that sort of way. And now, but Plato, he actually says, unless you have knowledge that is direct and without any mediator, right? Direct knowledge, unmediated knowledge. He says, you can't even call it real knowledge, right? And I later came to realize that I had assumed a Platonic understanding of knowledge, a Gnostic understanding of knowledge, that you could somehow have knowledge of God that was direct and unmediated. Well, we're not that kind of creature. God, who is not a creature, has unmediated knowledge. He has knowledge of things directly in their essence. So Plato said, unless I'm God, I don't have any knowledge. But then he said, I can become knowledge. I can become God, right? Through the philosophical inquiry, through the proper use of logic and reasoning, I can become God, right? Well, that's just the same old temptation in the garden.
Yeah, that's
right?
a broken metaphysics too, because we weren't ever designed
right.
that way, even from the jump.
Yeah, we're not designed to have that kind of
Christ
knowledge.
is walking with us.
Right.
Yeah.
And but here's the thing, like you read, so B.B. Warfield, he says that he doesn't think that Calvin's understanding of the sacraments even make any sense, because it's not knowledge unless it's unmediated direct knowledge. And he believes that God, through a miraculous moment of a miraculous act of the Holy Spirit, gives you that kind of knowledge in regeneration. I think B.B. Warfield has actually won the debate in American.
No, I think you're right. Absolutely.
Yeah, American Calvinism.
You're right.
To our own detriment. And I mean,
what's the pushback? What's the pushback on that? Signs and symbols? That's what we're talking about now?
Yeah. Well, I think the pushback is that's not the kind of world we live in, right? That you have to blind your eyes to reality to think that is what true knowledge is, right? We don't have any unmediated knowledge of anything, of even, well, there's just nothing knowledge-wise that's unmediated. All knowledge is poetic knowledge. Symbolic knowledge is mediated knowledge.
Because that's the kind of world that we live in.
It's
that's going down to the foundation of what is the world. Well, ultimately, the world is a symbol. You were saying, I think this is where Dante comes in too. Well, you were talking about earlier that the hunger that's from me. Even Adam, wake up hungry. Oh yeah, that's me, right? Get to know me. The same way when your sexual desires awaken, right? Dante figured that out too. He's like, whoa, that's a beautiful girl. Like, how do I get one of those, right? And so he had to learn to come to maturity to be able to get one of those, right?
And to realize
that
then was a window through which God was actually revealing himself and his beauty as well, right? I mean, this is one of the things I think that is so destructive about the transgender movement. Everything is the beauty of the female form can't be imitated, right? And to think that the beauty of the female form is something that you can just, take some drugs and
we can slap on. We can put a little
slap
clay
on. Just think that's a shallow understanding of how beautiful God made women, right? How as a vessel of glory. That is not a skin deep thing, right? That's not it's something that is displayed in the outward beauty, but it's not the depth of it. And I think we have by making a guy in a dress woman of the year, what we're saying is we think that the value of a woman has to do with her long hair and the shape of her skin or something, right? Well, that's not a biblical understanding of the depth of the beauty and glory of females, of women, right?
And the way you're getting there, I'm thinking about this, is because you're saying that women are a symbol of God.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And so what is the intent of that symbol in its rawest form is how you get to know the beauty of who God is even more so. And so what you're doing with this is you're corrupting the Imago Dei in such a way that you're missing out on the relationship that it's pointing to. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. That God, God is...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have to, because this is what drives me nuts. Whenever we have, and I don't want to talk about the transgender stuff. I want to put that on the shelf right over here. So hold this right here. That's the transgender stuff. We're going to put it right there. The way that we have allowed and promoted the false makeup of women in makeup, the way that they make themselves up, to the way that we are pushing breast surgeries and butt surgeries and liposuction, and we're trying to do all these things to exaggerate something that is in itself raw and beautiful, has opened up the door to say, if this is something that is malleable, now let's go back to the shelf and grab the transgender stuff, then I can make one of those too.
Right, exactly.
If this is something that is malleable, that doesn't have an objective metaphysics, right? Then I'll just make me up one of those, and I can put on some little plastic, and I can do this too. We can do the whole thing, and we can have a woman. And it's like, no. This is something much deeper than just that.
Right. That feminine honor, feminine glory, feminine beauty is literally not something that's skin deep. Right. It's an entire. So God is to put an image of God together. He is so great that it takes more than one person, right? Right. So, in one person by themselves is the image of God, right?
But this goes. Okay, go ahead.
But
right.
Then you put a man and a woman together, and in the creation narrative it says the image of God, right? Adam and Eve together, or Adam and Isha at that point. She's not renamed Eve yet. The image of God, right? Two people together, and then they come together, and a third person is born of the power of their love, and the image of God, right? So the image of God is not something that you can take a snapshot statically of something in creation and say, got it covered, right? The image of God, because God is infinite, God is infinitely beautiful, infinitely glorious, infinitely great, that it's something that a man and a woman together making a family over the course of their whole life is beginning to
Point
to and reflect, right? So it's the story of a man's life and a woman's life and their lives coming together and the children and the grandchildren. That whole story is the image of God, right? It's not just it's not just a momentary snapshot sort of thing, but we don't even know, we don't have category for it.
Right. And so this is why every tribe, every tongue,
Yeah.
every nation, it gets broader and wider, and to the point we're trying to fill up the unit because it's God's infinite. Therefore, what we're pointing to is going to take a lot.
Yeah.
And even then, we're still beginning because it's going to take eternity.
Right. Well, that's the history and the story of the whole world is the completion, the filling out of the bride of Christ.
And so this is, even that itself is a symbol.
Even that itself is a symbol, right? So, and then your wife is an image of the good and glorious formation of the perfect bride for Christ, right? So when you look at your wife, she is a picture of all of world history, or she's a microcosm of all of church history, moving, God building and moving a bride for a worthy bride for Jesus, right? Your wife is an image and picture, a microcosm of the history of the world, right? So, so I was hanging out with Marcus the other day, and this guy that we were talking to was a married guy, and he said something along the lines of, "Oh man, look at her over there. That's a beautiful woman." And Marcus, he was like, "What is wrong with you, man? You're married, right?" Just like that.
Yeah.
and he was, but Marcus's response was like, it's not even defending his own wife, but it's defending wives as a category, right? Like, what is? Like, do you realize you have a wife that is a microcosm of the history of the bride of Christ, right? Like, there's no way to think too highly, right? There's no way to think too highly of the calling of wife and mother, right? That's the microcosm of the history of all things.
So I want to take this back to the table. How is it, I'm going to take it back to the table and to the Trinity. I think I really want to drill down on, I'm trying to figure out a way to make everything flow from the table. I don't think that's insane to try and do.
Mm-mm.
To make the whole world flow out from what's happening at the table.
Yeah.
And I'm mainly seeing unity, but can you kind of walk me through maybe how the world flows out from the table and what we're missing? Not just how we're missing the table, but then what is the table? And then how does it influence the rest of the world? That's a big question.
Yeah, it really is.
I don't know where to start from.
And what I would say is it all flows out from the pulpit and the table, right? The word and the sacrament together are the center of the cosmos.
Those two things are not disconnected.
Yeah.
Right?
So it's not like, if you have,
does baptism flow in that too? Those are the three things, because we only have, what's the sacraments or the baptism and.
So I would say word and sacrament are so you this is something I think that's really, it has helped me to think about it, right? In the ancient cosmologies and Aristotle, you get the old drawings and everything's a perfect circle, right? And so they're always looking for the one center point of all things. Well, once we got to built our first telescope, and what we realized is that actually everything that things didn't rotate in perfect circles. They rotated in lengthened kind of egg shapes, and that there were two centers, right, to everything. And
with the cross there.
so you have, so everything goes around the sun.
Yeah.
But it doesn't go in a perfect circle. It actually goes around the sun, plus there's this other invisible point. And that there are two gravitational centers to all of the rotations of the heavenly planet.
So if you put a string in the center somewhere and you pushed it in like that oval shape that you're talking about, you'll get is two places where you see it.
Yeah, two center points, right? Yeah. So, here's...
Oh, that's right. You have the book. There's the Earth, Moon, and...
Yeah. So, this one, Sun, Moon, and Earth. This is a brilliant...
Yeah.
Brilliant book.
When I started asking you on metaphysics, you were like, "Here, get this."
Yeah.
Actually, I think you brought it to me.
Yeah, I got you a copy because it's not easy to get a hold of. So, and so
there goes the.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got so the ancient world, everything had a single center point, and they were all. But then their imaginations was always looking for the single point that held everything together. Well, as God blessed his people they began to get a better understanding of the actual heavens and how it functioned, you realize that everything actually has two centers. And we are a reflection of the heavens are a reflection of us, right? We're living in an integrated metaphorical universe. And so the two center points that the cosmos actually revolves around is Word and Sacrament, right? So,
okay, yeah, all right. I love what you just did there. I got to break it down real quick because it might have some people. Anybody who's been listening to us talk knows what just happened, but some people don't understand what just happened. You just made theology and something that's totally missing right now, where theology does not touch down on earth. We have theology up here, and then we have. It's broken from how it actually applies, and so people think that they're applying a lot of scriptures, and they're not really applying anything.
Often, yeah.
And so then you got the other side who's like, well, I don't need to apply; it's just gonna do its thing. And it's like, well, no, let me just show you the way that God made the world is very consistent with how you operate it spiritually, supernaturally, right? Those two things aren't separate. And so just watching you talk about what we see, and that's what this really interesting about this book is what you see. In your theological studies have representations in one way or another in reality. Those two things aren't separate.
They're not separate.
They're not separate. They're very much connected. And that weirds a lot of people out. So that's how you get your biblical exegesis that's grammatical historical.
Right.
Right. They don't actually hold on to the second, or would you say the first Bible that was written, which is creation, right? So the first Bible was written creation. They want to hold on to special revelation, not general revelation.
Right.
But general revelation is true.
It is true.
And it's God's book.
And we're told
they harmonize.
We're told to look there, right? We're told to expect them to harmonize. And what's interesting, the newer theologians often will write how they don't harmonize.
Right.
Right? That when you see the creation by itself without the revelation of the Word of God, then you expect God to be harsh and you expect God to be all this. Well, they're actually
because it's disconnected from the world.
Right. So that general revelation only reveals the condemning, reveals a condemning God if it reveals anything. That's because they've swallowed Darwinism. Darwinism reveals a condemning God. Right, because God is a giant grinding deathmonger.
That's That's also a monolithic problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's not
monotheism.
Monotheism. Yeah. That's what that is. So you're missing out on the Trinitarian understanding. Yeah. This is so helpful. So
any monadic. Right.
Delight in the Trinity. This is another one. These two books right here.
Any monadic
essential for Christian
God. You end up with, so...
Because what was God doing from all eternity? He was being a father.
Right.
Loving the Son.
Right.
And the Spirit going between them. So that is what creation is the symbol of.
Right.
A father loving his Son and the Spirit going between them. Right? And that's... Anyway, okay, we'll have to go there. But that is so important to see how... For me, anyway, to see how the world... actually works and operates and how God's word is in harmony with that.
Right.
Revealing more, being a symbol, revealing more about who he is.
Right. So you get the details, some of the details that aren't communicated in the symbols.
Right.
But the symbols truly do communicate, right? And
It's kind of like a movie in the behind the scenes.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I love about Calvin's Institutes is he calls the world the theater of God's glory. Right? That's the nature of the kind of creation we live in. He says it's the theater of God's glory. So what we should expect is to see God's glory, right? So he talks about that if you are studying creation truly, then you should expect a gracious God. Right? You should expect a loving God when you find him. Now you can't find him anywhere but in Christ. Right. That's where he has fully and completely revealed himself. But he sets your expectations to now sin has a noetic effect, Calvin calls it, right? It touches everything and it bends everything. Right? So our experience of creation and our interpretation of creation is often bent by our sin. But creation truly teaches us to expect a gracious God, right? Because the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike, right?
The sun is out.
Right, the sun is out. It's beautiful, right? Even
we have a planet that gives us food.
Right.
Like that one messed me up. God made the world in such a way that men are on a planet that gives them. It's not an accident.
Yeah, right.
We don't have that on Mars. We don't have that. From what we can tell right now, the only planet we have that on is this one.
Is this one, right? And so when Elon Musk talks about maybe we should nuke the poles of Mars and see if we can turn it into a planet that gives food.
He misses that.
Well, he's saying, I mean, there's something I think intriguing about the way he thinks, because he looks at it and he says, I wonder what secrets there are.
What's that symbol?
Right? I wonder if we blew up the poles. Is there a way, like there might be some sort of secret hidden way to turn Mars into a place that also gives food, right?
But then you think like that because you're thinking about the treasures that God has placed inside of planet Earth and be like, what?
Right.
What are they?
You start to expect the other planets to have, and then you look and you're like, what? It's not there. It's got to be there though, right? Like, right. That there's
what are these for? That's the metaphysical question.
Right.
What is it? What is it for?
What is Mars for? It's got to be there. So I think there's something interesting, intriguing about the question. Now, whether or not, I haven't studied the physics, the math to know if that is a good idea or a bad idea. But I think we could.
Planets is a good idea.
Yet. Well, he's not thinking of destroying it. He's thinking there's ice caps on there.
Yeah.
If we suddenly melt them, can we create? So what we have is gravity holds in the air.
Yep.
Whatever gravity is, it's a mysterious force. But it holds
another
symbol, right? It holds in the atmosphere.
Yep.
So he's wondering, could we get enough water into an atmosphere to make Mars into, and nuking the ice might get enough water into the atmosphere that it could create the layer that you need for life to exist. I don't know if that's
interesting.
It's an intriguing thought. We should be expecting to look at Mars and think, and it's the right question to ask, how can we serve people with that thing? Right? That planet should have a purpose wherein we can serve people, right? And perhaps it's just the beauty of it and the poetic servitude and all that.
That's why metaphysics is so important. What is it? What is it for?
Right. What is it? What it's
tells
for?
Us what to do with it. Right.
So
you got to figure out how to define what a woman is first.
Right. So, but what was the original question? I started talking about Elon Musk. We have the heavens declare the glory of God, and so creation does that all over the place, and so we should be expecting to find it that way. Calvin even talks about the mystery of food itself. Right? He says you look at food and you think, how does that work? How does that give us life? It's a dead thing. and is giving us life somehow. There's something mysterious in all food, that when we come to it with a true understanding, it should show us our utter dependency upon God as created beings.
2 fixed points is what you were talking
Yeah,
about.
so the two fixed points then are word and sacrament, and all of our interactions with God then, are rotating around word and sacrament all the time. God continually speaks. He's continually present with us in his voice. This whole thing is made of his words. Everything we are, everything that is created. And he didn't just speak and then walk away. He's continually speaking. Jonathan Edwards calls it the doctrine of constant creation, right? That we are...
How's he continually speaking?
So Jonathan Edwards was interacting with the deists who said God created this thing, wound it up, and let it go.
Right.
And he said, no, we're not at a distance from God. We're actually just as close to God now as the creation was as God spoke it into existence, because this place is God's story that he is continually speaking. Right? So we're made of words, but we're not made of words in a momentary sense. We're made of words the way any story that I tell is made of my words. Right? We are God's story, and he is continually speaking us into existence. He's continually speaking this place. Right? God is a story. So God spoke us into existence, but not in a way that ends up separate from him. Right? He spoke us into existence the way a storyteller says, once upon a time. Right? The story has been spoken into existence.
He's telling it.
And now he is telling this whole story. So we are as close to God in this moment as Adam was when God breathed into his nostrils, Edwards says.
That's interesting. So then, I still think so the 2 fixed points you said are word and sacrament.
Yeah.
And they tell us or symbolize for us the relationship that we have with God.
Yeah, so the word is not so. It's like when Schaeffer says, "He is there and he is not silent." Right?
Yeah,
That's the God we serve is not a silent God, a distant God. Well, he's also a God who keeps covenant, a God who created us for fellowship, and then is insistent, is constantly pursuing us and bringing us back. Right? We flee.
Reciprocal relationship that you were talking about.
Reciprocal relationship, and in the sacraments is the place where that relationship is signed and sealed and kept up. Is kept active, right? So in baptism, God puts his name on us.
That's the mark.
Right, that's the mark. We said, so what, the second commandment is do not take the name of the Lord in vain, right? And we tend to think that's the don't swear verse rather than the don't be a hypocrite command.
Is that really what's going on
it's
there?
Really what's going on, right?
Are both of them at play?
Both of them are at play, but we don't take the name that God has put his name on us.
Because I see
don't
rappers
carry it in a vain way or in a way that where the inside of our actions doesn't match the outside.
I've seen. I'm thinking of right now of Nick Cannon, who is adamant, man, don't be saying God's name in vain. I was like, and when you think about it, it's like, right, and don't live like his name is in vain either, right? Like those two things should go together the same way. It's because I see a lot of people very comfortable saying, hey, we're taking his name in vain, right?
Yeah.
And then their lifestyle is all it is taking his name in vain.
Yeah, so we have and that's tends to be a Pharisaical problem where you latch on to one or two sins, say, so long as I don't do those ones, I'm good. Those things become the external markers rather than faith, right? Faith is the marker. Faith is the mark, but this is where it always comes down to what is faith then? Right? Faith.
So I was just gonna ask you. Yeah. I feel like I left one book, which is J. Gershon Machen's book.
Yeah, What is Faith?
What is faith?
It's a great book, right? Because that's the question. What is faith? The word faith is thrown around all over the place. You got to have faith. But faith is believing in God's promises.
I need a deeper definition than that. That's since we've been talking. The only thing that has solved metaphysical problems for me that I've had is like, oh, John Knox book, squirrel, is the fact that I feel like faith, baptism, Lord's Supper have been the trinity of brokenness.
Yeah.
And how I understand the world.
Right.
Because I've made faith something that is more supernatural than it is foundational. Is this glass right here. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, right? For whatever reason, that not seen part really gets us excited. And so everybody, especially charismatic world, and even like I got, if it's something that we conjure up, right? And we got all wrapped up, and so I got this faith thing, and it's not what it is.
Yeah.
You know?
It's a, and this is what's difficult is because, presumption is when you believe something God hasn't promised, as if he has, right? You live according to something God hasn't promised. Faithlessness is when God promises something and you refuse to believe it. You refuse to live according to it.
Like infant baptism.
You're always trying to get me in trouble. But I do think, that is the question, right?
Yeah.
Has God promised us our children?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you raise your kids by faith?
Absolutely.
Right. So
I think every good Christian does, whether they submit. To
right.
that.
Yeah. Well,
which is the argument, which is like.
So it was a Baptist that explained to me the promises that God has given us to our children, right? So this Baptist was explaining, and he actually put it in a little pamphlet. God's promises to our children, right? And so God promises us our children, and so, but how do you get hold of promises? By faith, right? You trust them, right? You not by works, and so we are either raising our kids by faith or by works. Those are the options. If God has promised us our children, then we can raise them by faith. If we don't have promises, then we're screwed, right? You can't do anything. We live by faith from first to last. Everything depends upon whether or not God has promised it or not, right? And so, if God has promised us our children, then we raise our children by faith and not by works. Now, like James says, show me your faith without works, and I'll show you my faith by my works, right? The works will flow out of faith, but the works don't then turn around and become the reason that God saves, right? That God saves by grace, by Jesus alone, and we live by faith. We trust him. That's what it looks like. But it comes down to whether or not there are promises there, right? So if there are no promises for our children, then infant baptism is presumption. Mm-hmm. If there are promises for our children, then Baptists are Pharisees trying to raise their kids by works, right? Now, that's like broad strokes, obviously, because there are Baptists that raise their kids by faith. There are Paedo-Baptists that raise their kids by works.
Yep, that's right. I've seen both ways.
Right, yeah. So,
and that's why I praise a lot of my Baptist brothers who are raising their kids, because I've been at their houses and I'm like, you raising that by faith,
right.
You might as well put some water on it, because you're just doing it by faith.
But and this is where the nature of the sacraments comes in. So, if the sacraments are signs and seals of the promises of God, the general promises of God to individuals, then it makes sense, if there are promises about this child, to then apply the baptism to the child, right? Because the baptism is the promises of the general promises of God to his people attached being attached to an individual. It's the general name of God that he says, you are my people. You have my last name, right? You are Christians, right? It's like, I'm my father's son, and so I'm a Farley, right? That's my, his name is on me. The Farley name I carry it around everywhere I go. Well, God has put his name on his people, generally speaking. In baptism, his name is being put specifically on this person, this individual. So Calvin, in one of his essays I think it's in Ecclesiastical Advice, he says, you might think that the pastor's words preached generally to the congregation are meant for someone else. But when you chew and swallow the bread and the wine, you know that declaration of God's love is to you as an individual, right? The sacraments take the general promises of God to his people and individuate them, individualize them to this particular person, right? And so that's why you can't have the Lord's Supper without a sermon, and without a sermon, without the Lord's Supper, the sermon actually changes what it is, right? It's not the same. It's not the same act in the world without the Lord's Supper, because the Lord's Supper personalizes that sermon that you heard generally preached. It becomes to you as an individual. Every promise of God that was declared in that sermon, every declaration of love that was declared in that sermon to the world in general, is declared specifically to you. That in the eating and drinking of the Lord's Supper. Or sealed specifically to you.
If you really want to change the world, and you see the problems in the world that we're having, the first thing we need to do is have our Lord's Supper every week.
I mean, I think that's a really good start.
Right. That's
a really
we're drilling down on foundational pieces, right? Because what you just said to me.
And Calvin argues for weekly communion, so there's a history. It's not as if you're not being a revolutionary by wanting.
But that's not a hard place to start either. Kind of like pulling your kids out of government schools. It's not a hard place to start in exercising freedom, right? It's pretty simple. Right. It's challenging. It has some effort that you have to put towards it, but it's not a hard place to start. What is happening? How does the table communicate to us? So here's two things. You have these two center points, word and sacrament. When you're having word and no sacrament, you're missing out on the second center point. Right. So then you're off balance.
Yeah, you get wobbly.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. You get wobbly. Kitty wampus. How is it when you align those two, you have those two centers, word and sacrament, something happens where the metaphysical realities that are practiced at church on Sunday start broadening out to the rest of the world? Because that's the preaching of the word in one way or another is absolutely foundational, but the two married together take something that's not just up here, but it becomes very physical to us. We are actually eating of the very thing we just heard, right? And so those have effects. How do you what does the word and sacrament then communicate to us about our identity? Right? Because that's where we're trying to get to, so that we can say, okay, we got the foundations of the Trinity of who God is and the kind of world that God makes, a loving Father makes, and then this is how we are brought into relationship with him through Christ that we taste every week. That marks us as a certain type of being, right, that interacts with other beings in fellowship. And those out of fellowship? Well, how does the table start to interact and mess around with the world and people and individuals? So why is that such a central point to how we engage with critical race theory or social justice or other things, right? Why spend all your time talking about the Trinity, the word and sacrament, as a central point? Justification by faith alone as identity markers.
Yeah. So, and here's where you can't think like a Gnostic, right? Because you think, well, if I know the promises of God, what's added by eating and drinking bread and wine? I know them already. So what is added by that? And
Yeah, because all they are pieces of doctrines that I need to have to be orthodox.
right, yeah. It's like, I'm totally orthodox.
Yeah.
Because the table is a whole world in and of itself, right? The table is this microcosm of history, right? If we look at the way Paul describes it, like
The table is a microcosm of history. It's
right.
the whole world.
For I've received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this as my memorial," or in remembrance of me. After the same manner also he took the cup when he had supped, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do ye, you all, as often as you all drink it, in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this cup, or eat this bread and drink this cup, you show the Lord's death till he comes." Right? So the table pulls from the past, it pulls the crucifixion into the present, and then it pulls the future, when the return of Christ, into the present as well, right? So you've got, the table becomes this center point where the past and the future are actually pulled into the present by faith, right? So
No matter which time and space and history you are.
no matter where you are reminded.
That's a unique point in time and space, though, right? So, but the table is also pointing back to the Passover.
Pointing back to the Passover, I think it's pointing back more specifically to the peace offering.
Oh, okay.
Right. So the peace offering, which is the last of so you have a whole series of sacrifices done in a row. You've got the sin offering, the burnt offering, and then the peace offering is bread and wine after, and the bread is broken into three pieces. Some's given to the priest, some's given to the family, some's dropped into the fire and is eaten by God in the fire, and then you take the wine and you dump it into you dump it out. You're not allowed to drink it in the old covenant. The new covenant, the peace offering, becomes the bread and the wine, but now you get to drink the wine. And so I think there's a transformation of the peace offering. The Passover is the Passover is sort of all of the sacrifices before they're broken out and given more specificity.
I've always felt like that was like, okay, this is infantile.
Yeah.
You guys, okay, here's what you're going to do.
Right. So you've got the Passover as this beginning of the Jewish sacramental system, the Mosaic sacramental system. Now you've got Abraham has a sacramental system. Noah has a sacramental system. The Garden of Eden, all the way back to there, I think there's a sacramental system. And so, and as they develop, you get more and more broken out and explained.
Right, detail, yeah.
And sometimes you don't get the details of why things happen until way later. So we're told the priest is supposed to wear a particular kind of garment. It's a light, flowing white garment that they wear. It's not, and they're not supposed to wear wool. It's not until Ezekiel comes along and says, "Oh yeah, let me explain to you that that's because wool causes you to sweat, and sweat is a symbol of the curse," right? So there's a historical development that the whole thing is about, right? I think I sent you a John Denver song this week, Not Gnosticism.
Yeah.
He talks about.
Well, no, you got to tell the full story of that. First, you sent me a song, "We'll Bust You Out," by Nas.
Yeah.
And you were like, Gnosticism.
Illmatic.
Illmatic by Nas. And I turned it on, because I haven't listened to Illmatic in a long time. I turned it on, my kids like, whoa! Illmatic by Nas. Much Gnosticism as possible, right? It was fully loaded Gnosticism.
Fully straight Gnosticism. He's a really gifted poet.
Yeah.
Right? He's really gifted with words. But yeah, very Gnostic.
It's funny because you don't realize how poetry helps you understand the reality of the world you're living in. And when your poets are Gnostics, it tells you that's the running narrative, right? And so much so that even the people who want to correct Nas are using Gnosticism to correct him,
Right.
which is like what's really weird. Anyway, so then you sent
Yeah.
me John Denver.
Yeah. Well, I think I sent you in between.
There was another one.
I wish.
I wish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish I was a little bit
I
taller.
wish it was a little bit taller.
That whole album is fantastic. But it's not Gnostic.
Not
right?
Gnostic, right.
It's and it's funny and all. But then I sent you the John Denver one, and it's comparing time. It's comparing the time that his life has passed to the life cycle of grape and juice and wine. Right. So as he's getting older, his life, he's realizing that it took time to get to the wine in life. Right. So it's beautiful. It's a
Symbols?
beautiful. Yeah. It's symbol, and but it's this beautiful poem. And it's funny because John Denver died fairly young, and so he's imagining into the future what it's going to be like to get there someday. But if time is an enemy, we're dealing as Gnostics, right? If time is in the ancient world, Kronos, the god of time, he's the devouring god, right? Kronos eats everything, destroys everything, right? He eats his own children. He's the god that had to be overcome so he's the Titan that had to be overcome. The eternal gods, which is the second layer of gods in the pantheon of Greece, they exist because they destroyed Kronos. They destroyed time. Time was the enemy. And we often tend to still think that way because we think like Gnostics, right? That we need an eternal moment that pauses, right? And time is the enemy. Whereas if time is the thing that brings maturity and development and a greater love and a greater understanding and a greater life, then time no longer is an enemy. Time is a friend. Time is something that you embrace.
Time can't be a friend if you're going to lose everything if it keeps going.
Right.
And so that's Gnostic?
So that's Gnosticism, is that you've got to be freed from history. History is an enemy. History is a
acting
prison.
on you.
Yeah.
And the same, this is where Schlossberg, what's his name?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yep.
Idols for Destruction. By the way, that was written in the 80s, I think it was.
Yeah, late 70s even, maybe.
Something like what?
A long time ago.
He's writing right now.
Yeah.
But so then if time...
He's the prophet that we rejected because...
I think we do think of time as an enemy, the way that we, not just in what we say, but how we actually operate.
Mm-hmm.
Like we operate as if time is an enemy.
We're always trying to stay as young as possible and stay,
Well, that's, yeah. Even our pictures, we take pictures because we want to remember a moment because it's going to be gone. It won't be here anymore.
Right.
But, so, I guess how is, because time is acting on you, it is an enemy that is taking something from you and you can't control it? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think so. It is to embrace time is to embrace my own limitations, right? Is to
telling you you're not God.
Yeah, is to embrace the fact that you're not God, and that's the entire first half of Ecclesiastes is Solomon saying your limitations are a blessing. Your limitations are a blessing. Your limitations are a blessing, right? That the true joy is found in the embrace of our limitations. In the rejoicing in our limitations. When we quit trying to be God, we can actually enjoy our life, right? Our life becomes small, it becomes unimportant, it becomes little, but it suddenly becomes something that can be enjoyed.
It's not what social media is telling me right now, and there's nothing in the culture is telling me that.
Right.
Except for the sun going up, the sun going down. The mirror is the only thing that points that out to me.
Yeah.
That's. And the moments, I guess, in life. So the metaphysical realities of that are still there, but there's a wrong story that's trying to influence that reality.
Right.
So it's interesting.
Yeah. And so we have this, but then the supper is a huge reset of this understanding of time, right? Because everything about it, right? It pulls the death of Christ into the present, right? Not by re-crucifying, but in a poetic way. It pulls the future, where it's all headed, right? The return of Christ when he puts all things right, and then the wedding supper of the Lamb is celebrated, right? It becomes an appetizer for the wedding supper of the Lamb, right? You remember, oh yeah, this is where it's all headed. The wine on the table is fruit brought to maturity, right? Fruit brought to wisdom. You in the Garden of Eden, all they had was just fruit directly off the tree, right? But now the fruit God gives us is matured. It's brought to it's brought to where we're being brought, right? To maturity. So it's a celebration, right? You're in the middle. It reminds you that you're in a comedy, right? That you're not in a tragedy. Right? The story that you're in that has you can. There's always it's one of the reasons that there's always room for humor in a Christian understanding, right? I mean, this is what DC doesn't understand. This is why DC movies aren't enjoyable, because they take the conflict so seriously that there's no room for jokes anymore. And this is what the Avengers movies get. Like, yeah, okay, the world's about to die, but there's always time for a joke. There's always room for a joke, right? Because we live in a comedy, right? So even the biggest conflict.
On your left.
Yeah, exactly. Even in the midst of the biggest conflict.
But what a joke setup. What a setup, though, right?
Right. Oh, yeah.
All of a sudden, I got to pause for a second. That's so good. So you have this battle where the Avengers finally get the world restored back. Whole thing falls apart now because Thanos comes and blows up their spot. And Thanos is about to put it right back to the place it just was. Sounds like an Israel story almost, yeah. Right? And so the Avengers just lost a huge battle. And Captain America is sitting there fighting for the last thing, tooth and nail. It's him against, it's Athanasius, actually,
right, yeah.
against the rest of the world. And all of a sudden, the joke that came before where Captain America is running around and
from Winter Soldier,
from
like,
yeah.
What, 10 movies previous.
On your left. And no one had to go back and watch the movie. No one had to go back and figure out when he heard that go off in his ear and say, on your left. Everybody knew.
Exactly.
There's only been a few times in the theater where I heard applause or cheering,
people jump out of their chairs.
People jump out of their chairs and everybody high-fiving. It was one of those weird moments where I remember people like, oh, wow, and so that's the story that God is telling the same way, right? Like, and on your left, it's the comedy. That was a joke then, right? It was a joke then. It's like, on your left, and like here it is now, the joke is back in the most perilous time of the whole scene.
Right. And then what it does, so what a good punchline does is it goes back and it actually works in reverse back to the earlier words and it changes the meaning. Right. And so we've been told the punchline in advance. Right. And so now all of these things, you go through difficulties where you just don't have enough money, right? And you're like, okay, Lord, this is hard. I don't get it. But I know that this is, like, there's a resurrection coming, right? I know what kind of story I'm in. I don't, but like right now, I'm in that straight man part, right? But I know when it comes, and so we'll say this, I'll laugh about it someday, right? And we'll say that, and we know that because we know what kind of world we live in. And when you get to the punchline, you come back and these things have changed their meanings, right? The punchline works in reverse and comes back and changes it changes the meaning of all of the moments that you have gone through. And the table is a reminder of that coming punchline, right? So the table ends up becoming this thing where you get to Sunday and you have the Lord's Supper and you're like, okay, wait, let me think back through this week and put it into its proper perspective, right? How does this punchline change the meaning of the things that I've gone through this week? And sometimes sometimes you're not there yet. Like sometimes it's still just, no, I'm drinking the wine like Noah because the world just died. Right? And then you haven't gotten to the point where you can look back and laugh yet, but it's a reminder that day is coming. Right, you're having appetizers for the wedding supper of the Lamb. When you retell the whole history of the world in its proper perspective, and now you get all of the jokes. Right, that day is coming, and we're always looking for how do you get to it sooner? And sometimes there's just not a way to get to it sooner.
So then that is in the. That seems like, okay, that's future, pointing future. How does that work out in present with our current situation that we're facing right now culturally? So
that because the other thing that it does is it seals to us, it signs and seals to us the promises of God, which is so that we can live by faith in the present, right? So because living by faith is living according to the promises of God.
Okay, so this is where I know, and so what you just said, I want you to finish working that out. But this is what I've been thinking about ever since we've been talking about. I hit you up on the phone and asked you about globalism. What is globalism? And this is when you cracked it open for me when you were like, globalism is a Trinitarian heresy, right? You got international socialism, you got national socialism, right?
Yep.
Right? And when you start working through that, if there's anybody listening, needs to go back and listen to that show. That show does not have enough listens on as far as I'm concerned. And it's the shortest one we've ever done. How is the shortest show that we've ever done not have as many listens? It's like 25 minutes or 28 minutes or something like that. That should be the one that just blows up. That show, that was on accident because I just called you as I got to record this. I'm heading to the studio. But the Trinitarian heresy inside of globalism is the ontological realities and economic realities can't exist. What I'm seeing, though, is everybody sees globalism as a problem, one world order as a problem.
Right.
They're seeing Marxism as a problem. They see the fruit of those things. They're tasting all of them. And so people will say things like, we got to fight China because China's a problem. Even the people that are socialists are saying that about China because they like national socialism, but they ain't so fond of this international socialism, right?
That's a threat.
Right, that's a threat because then I don't get to be the god of the system. Right? That's a problem. I want to be the god. And so you have this weird kind of battle there. And then you have the other people like Christians and conservatives who are saying, we have to fight against China. So then let's create, this, they aren't saying it like this, but this is what they're doing. Let's create a form of Marxist socialism ourselves, like we did in World War I and World War II, in order to be able to fight against these globalist powers.
Yeah, we've got to get powerful enough.
Yeah, so basically national socialism needs to beat out international socialism because of international socialism when we're done, right? But we don't have a problem with socialism ultimately, right? Or a national, I think I said that right.
Yeah.
So I want to be thinking about, so how do you beat out China? And this goes all back to what we were just talking about. We said faith is believing God promises. The promises, the way that I've been thinking about this is that the promises that God has given us need to first start in these the closest spheres that we have to us that we have operation. Self-government, our family government, and from there our church government onto the civil magistrate. You create the freest, most joyful home and family that you possibly can. First of all, you act that way with yourself. You free yourself from your sin, right? You got to fight your sin. You got to go to war with that first. And if you don't go to war with your own sin, you can't do that with your family. It's impossible. But creating a genuinely joyful, ruckus, happy family is the only way that you beat national and international socialism.
Right.
And you don't beat it any other way.
No.
You have to create this is just speaking generally now, you have to create the freest society in order to beat the enslaved society.
Right.
It doesn't work the other way. But you have to be free first yourself. God had to take his people out of Egypt and then get the Egypt out of them before they can get into a promised land, right?
Because Machiavelli was not right about the nature, about the malleable nature of reality, right? So we've talked about this, but Machiavelli said if we can get enough power into one spot,
place,
we can transform reality, right? And that's socialism. Socialism says we can transform reality if we get enough power collected into one spot. Then we can transform reality. We can transform human nature. We can transform the economic realities. We can make the world not a covenantally bound place anymore. Make it into something else.
It's so important.
It is. But the world is a covenantally bound place. And so that's how have we talked about Polycarp? I'm trying to remember.
No, I don't think, not very much.
Not very much.
I know we've talked about
Polycarp, but so
remind me again.
So Polycarp, he's in Roman Empire. There's really 10 major persecutions, waves of persecution, and Polycarp gets caught up in one of them. He's in his 80s, and he is well known as a pastor of in a Roman city, and they have it's a city that's large enough to have a coliseum where they throw people to the lions. And Polycarp's assistant pastor is a man named Germanicus, and he's during the persecution he's arrested and he's brought in and he's fed to the lions. Well, the problem is they'd been feeding people to the lions all day, and the lions weren't hungry anymore. And so Germanicus, they throw him down there, and they broke one of his legs in the process. And he starts crawling, and everybody thinks that he's confused because he's crawling towards the lions. And all of the people are laughing, and they're looking at Germanicus, and he pulls himself right up to one of the big lions with the mane, and he reaches up and he grabs the lion by the side of the mane. The lion roars and he shoves his head inside this lion's mouth. The lion clamps down and kills Germanicus. And the place just goes silent because they've never seen anything like that. Like, this guy was thrown to the lions, and usually people run away from the lions. And he was like, Lord, you threw me to the lions, and the lions, he was like so excited to be a martyr, and the lions aren't hungry. And so he crawls over to the lions. And he's like, hey, lions, don't you know why we're here?
Yeah, I'm going to be a good hero.
I'm going to be a good hero. Like, this is what you sent me for. I get my role in this story. And so he crawls over to the lions, and the place, it goes silent, and then it like bursts in, and they start chanting, send for Polycarp, send for Polycarp, right? If the assistant pastor gets us this kind of thing, what about the pastor? But Polycarp's in his 80s, though. And it's back when there wasn't a separate police and an army, so they send out the army for Polycarp. And they get to Polycarp, and he had heard that they were coming for him, and so he starts preparing lunch, and these soldiers show up, and he says, oh, I'm glad you're here. I've been making lunch for you. And they sit down to lunch, and they said, oh, thank you so much. We're actually looking for Polycarp. Do you know where he is? And he's like, oh, no, that's me. I knew you were looking for me. I wanted to make sure you guys were well fed before you arrested me. And so he feeds them lunch, and then they arrest him. They bring him back in a cart, and because he's 80 years old, they can't walk him all the way there. Well, the head soldier, when they get there, says, look, Polycarp, all you got to do is deny Christ and you'll live. And he says, no, thank you. I would rather not deny Christ. And he says, you're an old man. What's the big deal? Just deny Christ. And I said, I'm trying to have compassion on you. And Polycarp says, I'm not going to be taking your advice. Please just lead me in. And the man yanks him down, and he twists his ankle out of joint. And so Polycarp has to limp in to go stand before the governor of the whole area. And the governor says, Polycarp, I'm going to give you an opportunity to be saved. Deny Christ, and I won't kill you. And he says, Governor, I'm glad you've brought me here. I'm here to give you an opportunity to be saved. Repent of your sins and you can avoid an eternity in hell. And he says, do you know who I'm in? I'm the one that holds your life in my hands. And he says, no, Christ holds my life in his hands, and he has never done me any harm for 80 years. So why would I deny him now? Right? And he says, just admit that Christ hasn't protected you, and something along the lines of, because the Christians were accused of atheism because they didn't believe in the pantheon, and he says, just say away with the atheists, and that's all it will take. And he turns to the crowd and he says, away with the atheists, to the crowd. And now the governor is just angry as all get out, and he says, don't you understand who I am? And he says, I understand who you are. You're a man that is going to stand before Jesus someday and be judged. And you right now have the opportunity to set a time so that I can explain to you the gospel and you can be saved. So he says, throw him to the lions. They said, oh, we already put the lions away for the night. He says, burn him at the stake, right? And so they go and they gather wood and they burn him at the stake. And when he is first walking in, all of the people that are there with him, just as he first walks in, everybody said they heard a voice say to Polycarp, and Polycarp, play the man. Right? Play the man as you go in there. Right? And everybody, all of the witnesses said, we actually heard God's voice visibly to Polycarp, or audibly to Polycarp as he went in. Well, was it 1,200 years later, you have Ridley and Latimer in Oxford Square. They are getting ready to be burned at the stake because they are refusing to deny Christ right towards the beginning of the English Reformation. They've been accused of having the Bible and having the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's a strange time in history because there's churches everywhere, and the bishop, he brings this accusation of the teaching of the New Testament and the Old Testament and the New Testament in English. And the bishop says, I'm proud to announce I don't even know what the Old and New Testaments are, right? So you've got churches everywhere, but the gospel is gone, and it's been gone for 50 years, over a generation, and so they're arrested and they're being dragged out to be burned at the stake, and Latimer turns to Ridley and he says, I know what story we're in. He says, play the man, Master Ridley. Right? We get to be Polycarp. Right? We get this opportunity to be Polycarp. He says, play the man, Master Ridley. Today we'll light a fire in England that will never be put out. Because when Polycarp was burned at the stake, it was the Roman Empire that didn't survive. Right? The Roman Empire was the one that was destroyed. Polycarp we still talk about. We don't even know the name of the governor that burned him at the stake. Polycarp won, right? And that governor was the straight man, right? Polycarp was the one that saw, oh wait, I know the punchline to this story, right? So and because they had read their Eusebius, Master Ridley and Latimer, they said, I know this story. I know the punchline. These authorities are the ones that won't survive this. They're sending us to the stake. Play the man, Master Ridley. Today we light a fire in England that will never be put out. Right? And that's what it looks like to understand the story that we're living in. To understand that it's not a series of snapshots. That there are times when we get to go to the stake. There are times when the Bible is suppressed. There are times when the Bible is passed through from chained hand to chained hand to chained hand. but it's always the gospel that prevails, right? Because the promises of God are true, even in those moments when it doesn't look true. Now, every Sunday morning, when we sit down and we eat the bread and drink the wine, Ridley, Latimer, Polycarp, right? They're there with us eating, right? We're sitting down at the table and we're saying, oh, these are our people. We're in the same story. We're the promises of God that were true for them, that we've seen prevail throughout history, are true for me in this moment. And how do I know it? Because I'm eating the promise. I'm drinking the promise. And I'm tasting it. Right? The Lord is just as good to me as he was to them.
There's nothing else to say. It's gonna be better than that at the end of the day. So